The rain came down like it had a grudge against the world. It hammered the roof of Wren Calloway's pickup truck in sheets so thick he could barely see the white line at the edge of Route 9, and what little he could see was blurring fast. The wipers slapped at full speed and still lost the argument. Wren had both hands on the wheel knuckles, aching back stiff from 12 hours of carpentry work that had started before sunrise and ended long after dark. His client, a woman named Mrs. Hartfield in the new development off Birchwood, had changed her cabinet measurements 3 times in one day. 3 times. He'd recut the same panel twice and smiled through it because that was the job, and the job paid for the house on Clover Street, and the house on Clover Street was where Piper was. Piper. 7 years old, probably still awake, probably negotiating with Rhett for one more cookie before bed. She had a gift for negotiation that her mother would have recognized immediately, that particular combination of wide eyes and irrefutable logic that made adults feel strangely outmaneuvered. Wren felt the familiar pull in his chest when he thought about her, that mix of love so large it sometimes felt structural, like it was holding him upright, rather than the other way around. He shifted in the seat, rolled his right shoulder to work out the knot that had been living there since Tuesday. The heater in the truck was running, but the damp had gotten into his jacket anyway, and the cold was the particular kind that comes from exhaustion rather than temperature. He'd been awake since 5. He was 34 years old, and some days his body filed formal complaints about that fact. The old section of Route 9 passed through the edge of Millhaven before the road widened into the commercial stretch closer to town. Out here it was just fields and tree lines and the occasional property set back from the road with a single porch light burning. The bus stop on the eastern edge had been decommissioned 3 years ago when the county rerouted the local line. Nobody used that stretch of road at night. There was no reason to. His headlight swept across it almost by accident, catching the reflective post first, and then the bench beneath the corrugated overhang, and then the figure sitting on that bench, and Wren's foot lifted off the accelerator before his brain had fully processed what his eyes were seeing. A woman, sitting perfectly still in the rain. She wasn't sheltering under the overhang. She was on the forward edge of the bench, fully exposed, her head bowed so low that her hair hung in wet ropes past her jaw. Both hands were pressed flat against her thighs. She wore something thin and pale, a dress, and it was so saturated with rain it looked like a second skin. A small wheeled suitcase lay on its side in the water, pooling at her feet. Wren drove another 40 yards on reflex before his foot found the brake. He sat there with the truck idling, the wipers working furiously, rain drumming on the cab. The smart thing was to keep going. It was late, he was exhausted, and getting involved in other people's crises had a way of metastasizing. He knew that. He'd learned it the hard way more than once. But he pictured Piper. He pictured Piper sitting exactly like that in the rain alone, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. He put the truck in reverse. He pulled off the road 20 feet from the stop and climbed out into the storm, leaving the engine running and the headlights on so the beam reached the bench. The rain soaked through his jacket in about 4 seconds. He walked forward with his hands slightly out from his sides, visible the way you'd approach something you didn't want to startle, and when he was close enough to be heard over the rain, he stopped and raised his voice just enough to carry. She flinched so violently she nearly came off the bench. Her hands flew up in front of her face and her whole body torqued sideways away from his voice, and she made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something raw and reflexive at the back of her throat. And it was in that moment, when she turned her face toward him and her hair fell away from it, that Wren saw the blindfold. Black fabric soaked through like everything else, wrapped carefully across her eyes and knotted at the back of her head. Not the kind of thing you put on for sleep, the kind of thing you wear because you have a reason to wear it. Her eyes behind it would see nothing. She had heard his footsteps and had no idea where he was, how many there were, what was coming. He stopped immediately, kept his voice level and quiet, pitched low so she could track where the sound was coming from and feel the distance in it. "I'm not going to come any closer. My name is Wren Calloway. I live here in Millhaven. I saw you from the road, and I stopped because I was worried. That's all I am. Just worried." She was breathing in rapid, shallow pulls, her hands still raised, fingers spread. The rain ran down her forearms and dripped from her elbows. She was shaking, and he couldn't tell yet how much was cold and how much was fear, and how much was something else entirely. "Please." Her voice was wrecked, scraped clean by what sounded like hours of crying. "Please, I'm just waiting. He said someone would come. He promised someone would come for me." Wren looked up and down the empty road. He looked at the decommissioned schedule posted at the edge of the overhang, the paper gone translucent with moisture. He looked back at her. "The last bus on this route ran at 4:15 this afternoon. There won't be another one until tomorrow." He paused, giving her a moment to absorb that. "How long have you been here?" She didn't answer. Her hands came down slowly, but her whole body stayed coiled, still turned partially away from him, chin down, tracking every sound he made with the particular alertness of someone whose hearing had learned to do the work her eyes no longer could. "I need to wait," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard, fighting something down. "He said he just needed to make a phone call. He said he'd be right back. He said—" She stopped. Her throat moved. He said a lot of things, Wren thought, and none of them brought him back here. He crouched down both knees so he was well below her eye level, even though she couldn't see him because the posture changed something in his voice when he spoke from it, made it land softer. "I don't know what happened here tonight. I don't need to know, not right now. But I can tell you that nobody is coming down this road. Not in this rain, not at this hour. Whatever he promised you, it's not going to happen tonight." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I have a truck running right up there. Heat's on. I've got a 7-year-old daughter at home and a brother who's probably still awake. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, wherever you want to go, a hospital, the police station, anywhere you name. But you cannot stay here. You understand that you cannot stay here." The crying came then, not the controlled kind, the other kind, the kind that had been held back so long it didn't ask permission when it finally broke through. Her whole frame shook with it, shoulders rounding forward, one hand coming up to cover her mouth, and the sounds she made were so gutted and private that Wren felt like an intruder just witnessing them. He stayed where he was. He didn't move toward her, didn't try to speak over it. He just stayed. When it began to exhaust itself, when the shaking became shivering and the sobs came further apart, she lowered her hand and turned her face back in his direction. "I don't have anywhere to go." The words came out stripped down, no performance in them, just fact. "I don't have money. I don't have my phone. I don't have any identification." A pause. "I don't have anything." Wren stood up slowly. He stepped forward 1 pace, stopped, gave her time to hear where he was. "Then come with me. Just to get warm. That's the only thing that has to happen right now, just getting you out of this rain. Everything else can wait until you're dry and you've got something hot in your hands." He waited. "I promise you're safe. I'm going to say that as many times as you need to hear it." She didn't move for a long moment. The rain filled the silence between them, relentless and indifferent. Then she nodded one small motion of her head like it cost her something. He came around to her left side and crouched to pick up the suitcase, and that's when he noticed it. The outside pocket of the case was unzipped, which was odd in itself, and as he lifted it to set it upright, something shifted inside the pocket, and a corner of white paper showed through the gap. He didn't open it. He didn't have the right to open it. He zipped it closed, and he held out his arm so she could feel it against the back of her hand, and she gripped just above his elbow with both hands and let him lead her to the truck. Getting her into the passenger seat required patience and clear instruction because she had no frame of reference for the height of the running board or the placement of the door handle, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned very recently that the world was full of edges she couldn't see coming. Wren talked her through each step without rushing a single one of them. Once she was in, he set the suitcase on the back seat, cranked the heat to maximum, and pulled his rain jacket off to lay it across her lap because it was the only dryish thing he had. She pulled it around her shoulders without being asked. Her teeth were chattering. He got back behind the wheel and pulled onto the road, and for a while neither of them spoke. He turned the heater vents toward her. He kept his eyes on the road and gave her the silence because silence right now was something she could control, and control was something she had very little of. After about 2 minutes, she said, "Thank you." Her voice was still raw, but it had something in it now that hadn't been there before. something tentative and fragile like the first light after a very long night. "You don't need to thank me." He kept his eyes forward. "What's your name?" A pause that lasted just long enough to suggest she was deciding something. "Lena. Lena Voss. I'm going to take you to my house on Clover Street, Lena. You'll have dry clothes, a hot shower if you want one, and something warm to drink. Then we figure out whatever comes next. Okay?" She nodded again. Her hands wrapped around the jacket's lapels, and she turned her face toward the side window as if she could feel the darkness passing outside, even if she couldn't see it. The house on Clover Street was small and old and had needed repainting for 2 years, but it had warm light in the windows and a covered porch that didn't leak anymore because Wren had fixed it himself in September. He pulled into the driveway and came around to help Lena down before going ahead to unlock the front door, and when he guided her up the 2 porch steps he heard her exhale slightly as the warmth from inside reached them. Rhett was on the couch with a paperback thriller and a bowl of pretzels. He looked up, saw Lena, saw the blindfold and the wet clothes and the particular quality of stillness on her face that meant someone was holding themselves together with real effort, and he put the book down without being asked. "Found her at the old bus stop on Route 9. Wren kept his voice neutral, matter-of-fact, because Lena was listening to every word. "She needs dry clothes and something warm. Can you see if Claire's things in the hall closet include anything that might fit?" Rhett looked at his brother for exactly 1 second, reading the situation in that way that only siblings can, and then he was on his feet and moving down the hall without a word. That was Rhett. He complained about almost everything in life, but came through when it actually counted, which was the thing about him that mattered. Wren guided Lena to the couch. He described the layout of the room as they moved through it. The coffee table 2 feet ahead, the couch to her left, the armrest she could use to orient herself. She sat down carefully, both feet flat on the floor, hands in her lap, and Wren got the sense of a person who had recently had to rebuild every small habit from scratch, who had learned that nothing could be assumed anymore. He was getting her a glass of water from the kitchen when he heard the soft thunder of small feet on the stairs. There was no stopping Piper once she was in motion. She came down the last 3 steps at a run, turned the corner into the living room, and pulled up short when she saw the stranger on the couch. 7 years old, hair loose and tangled from sleep, she probably hadn't been getting wearing the pajamas with the small yellow stars. She stood in the doorway with her head tilted slightly, studying Lena, with the particular unguarded concentration of a child who had not yet learned that staring was impolite. Lena heard the footsteps stop and turned her face toward the doorway. "Hi." Piper's voice was careful, quieter than her usual register. "Are you okay? You're really wet." "I was outside in the rain for a while." Lena's voice was steadier than it had been in the truck. Something about the child's directness seemed to simplify things. Piper came into the room and climbed up onto the couch on Lena's left side with complete unself-consciousness, settling cross-legged with her knees touching Lena's thigh. She studied the blindfold with open curiosity, leaning forward slightly to look at it from different angles. "Are you playing a game, or do you actually not see?" A sound came out of Lena that it took Wren a moment to identify because it was so unexpected given the last hour. She was laughing, small and brief and bruised around the edges, but real. "I actually don't see. I'm blind. The blindfold helps me feel more comfortable in unfamiliar places." She paused. "Is that strange to you?" Piper considered this with genuine seriousness, chewing her lower lip. "My teacher has a cousin who's blind. She says he goes hiking." Piper nodded like this settled something important. "So you can probably do a lot of stuff. You're probably actually really brave and you just don't know it yet." Lena's smile didn't fully form but came close. Her jaw tightened and then released, and she exhaled through her nose, and Wren, watching from the kitchen doorway, understood that what he was witnessing was someone trying not to cry for the 4th or 5th time that hour for reasons that were entirely different from the previous times. Rhett came back with an armful of things from the hall closet, gray sweatpants and a cream-colored sweater and thick wool socks, and Wren took them and walked Lena to the bathroom, describing the layout step by step. Shower straight ahead, controls on the left, hot is to the right. towels on the rack at 2 o'clock from where she was standing, clothes on the counter directly in front of the sink. He told her there was a hook on the back of the door for her wet things. He told her to take as long as she needed. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said, holding the folded clothes against her chest. "You don't have to." He said it the same way he'd said it in the truck, simple and final, because gratitude right now was a weight she didn't need to carry on top of everything else. "Just get warm." He pulled the bathroom door closed and went back to the kitchen where Rhett was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his pretzel bowl pushed to the side. "What actually happened?" Rhett's voice was low, and there was an edge in it, not toward Wren, but toward whatever the answer was going to be. "I don't know yet." Wren filled the kettle and set it on the burner. She was at the Route 9 stop, the old one. Alone, no phone, no ID, no money. Whoever left her there is not someone she's going to talk about for the next 5 minutes, so we wait. He got 2 mugs down from the cabinet. "She's blind, Rhett. Someone left a blind woman at a decommissioned bus stop in the middle of a rainstorm. I need you to sit with that for a second." Rhett's jaw set hard. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Piper appeared at the kitchen doorway in the way she sometimes did at night, soundless, watching both of them. Wren looked at her, and she looked back at him with those eyes that saw too much for 7. "Is she going to be okay?" Piper asked. "She's going to be okay." He said it with more certainty than he had any right to feel, but that was what you said to 7-year-olds. And then, because Piper, "Back to bed. I'll come up in 10 minutes. Piper held his gaze for exactly the amount of time required to communicate that she was going, because she chose to, not because she was told to, and then she disappeared back up the stairs with the yellow-starred pajamas and her uncanny ability to make adults feel assessed. When Lena came out of the bathroom 25 minutes later, her hair was still damp but no longer dripping, and she moved with slightly more steadiness in the dry clothes, one hand trailing the hallway wall to track her position. She made it back to the living room and found the couch by memory of the earlier trip. Rhett set a mug of tea with honey on the cushion beside her and guided her hand to it without making anything of the gesture, and she held it in both palms and said nothing for a while. Wren sat in the chair across the coffee table. Rhett settled in the far corner of the couch. The 3 of them sat in the warmth of the quiet house with the rain still hammering outside and let the silence do some of the work. "Lena," Wren said eventually, "you don't have to tell us anything tonight. You don't owe us an explanation. You can just be here." She wrapped her hands more tightly around the mug. Her profile in the lamplight was still controlled, every muscle holding a shape that had taken effort to build and might not hold much longer. "It was my husband." She said it quietly, and then stopped as if testing whether the words would collapse the room. They didn't. The rain continued. The lamp burned. "He's the one who left me there." Neither Wren nor Rhett spoke. They let it stand. "We've been married 4 years. Her voice had gone to that flat, careful register that people sometimes used when discussing things they had not yet fully allowed themselves to feel. 9 months ago, I lost my vision. Retinal infection. It was fast, it was—" She paused. "It was the end of the world I knew. Gideon, my husband, he was supportive. He said the right things. He took over our finances because I was struggling to manage anything, and he said it would reduce my stress, and I was too lost in what was happening to me to question it." Her thumb moved back and forth across the surface of the mug. "I had a business. Custom jewelry design. 10 years of building it. About $190,000 in savings. He said he'd manage it while I adjusted." Rhett's face went very still. The way faces went still when something confirmed what they'd already suspected, and the confirmation was worse than the suspicion. 2 months ago I started hearing things. Phone calls he took in another room, his voice low and quick, certain words I didn't recognize. I tried to ask him about it. He told me I was paranoid." A pause. "He said the blindness was affecting my mind, that I was imagining patterns that weren't there. He said it gently every time, which somehow made it worse because I almost believed him. There were days I thought maybe I was losing my grip on things." Her chin came up slightly. "But I wasn't. I know the difference between my imagination and a real voice through a wall." "He was gaslighting you," Wren said, and the control in his own voice cost him something to maintain. Yes, the word was simple and devastating. Yesterday morning he told me he'd found a specialist in Cincinnati who had success treating my type of condition. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe someone was trying to fix this, so I got in the car and I didn't ask questions about the route or the time or why we seemed to be heading away from the city rather than toward it. She set the mug down on the cushion beside her and folded her hands in her lap. He stopped, told me the car was overheating, that we were near a bus stop, that I should sit down, and he'd be back in 5 minutes. He put his hand on my back and guided me to the bench. And I sat down. Her hands tightened around each other. I kept waiting. I called out for him. I called his name for probably an hour before I understood what was actually happening. The rain found a gap somewhere in the gutters and began a persistent drip against the porch railing. "He took my phone before we left the house," Lena continued. "Said the battery was dead, that he'd charge it in the car. He took my wallet too. Said he'd put it in his jacket so I wouldn't lose it." Her voice didn't break on any of this. It was the evenness of it that was worse. He thought it through, every piece of it. Wren stood up from the chair. He didn't do it from agitation. He did it because his body needed to do something, and standing was the smallest available option. He walked to the window and looked out at the rain and counted silently to 5. "You need to stay here tonight," he said without turning around. "In the morning we figure out the next step, but tonight you stay here." She didn't argue. She nodded once, and some of the rigid control in her posture gave way, not to collapse, but to something closer to exhaustion, the particular sag of a person who has been holding themselves upright by will alone for hours and has finally found something solid enough to lean against. Rhett took her to the guest room at the end of the hall, describing the layout the way Wren had done in the bathroom, the furniture, the window, the light switch she didn't need. Wren heard the low sound of Rhett's voice down the hall, unhurried and steady, and felt something in his chest shift on his brother's behalf. He went back to the couch and reached for the suitcase he'd set on the seat beside the armrest. He unzipped the outer pocket where he'd seen the white paper shift when he'd picked it up at the bus stop. The envelope came out folded once. His name wasn't on it. And Gideon Voss was typed on the front in clean sans-serif font, and below the name was an account number, and below that a contact line for a firm in Brentwood, Tennessee, which appeared to be an insurance broker. He unfolded it. It took him about 45 seconds to understand what he was looking at. He read the relevant section 3 times. Life insurance policy, sole beneficiary Gideon T. Voss, insured party Lena C. Voss, face value $500,000 policy, effective date 14 months prior, current status active. He looked at the date the policy had been purchased. 7 months ago. 2 months after Lena lost her sight. The math was simple, and the math was monstrous. Gideon Voss had not left his wife at a bus stop in a rainstorm because he wanted out of the marriage. He had left her there because a bus stop in the rain on an empty road at night was the kind of place where things happened to blind women alone, and if something happened, he collected $500,000 and nobody could point to him. Wren sat with that for a long moment. The house was quiet. The rain was easing. Down the hall, Lena Voss was lying in a guest bed in his dead wife's clothes, and she had no idea what was in this envelope, and he wasn't going to be the one to tell her at 1 in the morning after everything she'd already absorbed tonight. He took out his phone and called Detective Sawyer. It rang 4 times before the answer came, the particular voice of someone who has learned to wake up fully in the first second, because the middle of the night is when the bad things announce themselves. "Wren, it's late." "I know." Wren looked at the document in his hand. "I need you to listen to me carefully because I found something tonight, and the woman it belongs to is asleep in my guest room, and I don't think she's safe going back to wherever home is." A pause on the line, then the sound of movement sheets a lamp. "Tell me," Wren told him. He read the relevant sections of the document aloud. He described the bus stop, the suitcase, the way the envelope had been tucked into the outer pocket like it had been placed there deliberately or fallen from a jacket. He described Lena, the blindfold, the absence of a phone and wallet and identification, the story she'd told about Cincinnati and a specialist and a husband who parked and walked away. Sawyer was quiet for a moment after Wren finished. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of someone choosing words with care in the early hours of the morning when care still matters. "She cannot go back to that house," Sawyer said. "I mean that. Not until I've run this through properly. Can she stay with you?" "She's already here." "Good. I'll be over in the morning. Don't let her call him. Don't let her contact him in any way tonight." Wren said he understood and ended the call. He set the insurance document on the kitchen counter under his coffee mug so it wouldn't move, and he turned off the living room lamp, and he stood in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the rain diminish. Down the hall behind the door at the end, Lena Voss was either asleep or lying awake in the dark, that was always dark for her now, in borrowed clothes in a stranger's house waiting for something she had no name for yet. She had spent hours waiting tonight for a man who wasn't coming. She didn't know that the man who had come instead had found the piece of paper that explained everything. She didn't know that the woman who owned the sweater she was wearing had been loved so completely that her absence was still a physical presence in this house. She didn't know that there was a 7-year-old upstairs who had already decided in the uncomplicated way of children that a stranger on the couch deserved kindness simply because she existed and was hurting. Wren stood in the dark with the rain fading outside and thought about the choices that brought people to specific moments. He'd almost kept driving. He'd gone 40 yards past her before his foot found the brake, 40 yards of his life in which everything could have stayed exactly as it was, manageable and exhausted and quietly lonely and fine. Fine was what you called things when you'd stopped expecting more than fine. He went upstairs and checked on Piper, who was asleep with one arm off the side of the bed and her favorite book open face down on the pillow beside her. He pulled the book out gently and set it on the nightstand. He stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe, and then he went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. Detective Sawyer arrived at 7:45 in the morning with a thermos of coffee he didn't offer to share and a legal pad he'd already filled 3 pages of before he knocked. He was 51, built like someone who had once been an athlete and had since redistributed the effort into stillness, and he had the particular quality of attention that made people feel simultaneously safe and slightly accountable. He sat at the kitchen table across from Wren and looked at the insurance document for a long time without speaking. Lena was in the living room with Piper, who had appointed herself the morning's entertainment committee and was currently describing the backyard through the window with the commitment of a nature documentarian narrating the movements of a squirrel with vocabulary that suggested she'd been rehearsing. The sound of it drifted through the kitchen doorway in fragments, and Sawyer glanced toward it once before returning to the document. 7 months ago. Sawyer set the paper flat on the table and pressed one finger against the policy date. She goes blind 9 months ago. He waits 2 months. Then he buys $500,000 of life insurance on a woman whose vision just failed and who he's already started isolating from her own finances. He looked up at Wren. He didn't decide to do this the night he left her at that bus stop. He decided months ago. The bus stop was just the execution. Wren had been awake since 5. He'd stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard dry out from the previous night's rain and thought about the word execution. And now, here it was in Sawyer's mouth, and it landed the same way it had in his own head, heavy and without margin. "She doesn't know about the document," Wren said. "She will this morning." Sawyer capped his pen. "I need to talk to her. Gently, but I need to talk to her. And I need you to understand that what she tells me in the next hour determines whether I can build something that keeps her safe long term or whether we're patching a situation that falls apart in 2 weeks. Rhett came in from the back door with mud on his boots and the dog-eared thriller tucked under his arm, which meant he'd been on the back steps since early morning processing things in the way Rhett processed things, which involved solitude and not discussing it. He looked at Sawyer, then at the document, then at Wren, and went to the counter and poured himself coffee without a word. Sawyer was measured and unhurried with Lena in the way that good detectives were. He introduced himself, sat across from her, and asked her to tell him what had happened the previous evening at whatever pace felt manageable. She told him. The same stripped-down precision she'd used the night before, the same careful accounting, and Sawyer took notes and asked quiet, clarifying questions and did not react visibly to anything she said. When she finished, he set his legal pad on the coffee table. "Lena, I found something last night in your suitcase." Wren's voice came from the armchair beside the couch. "In the outer pocket. I should have told you immediately. I'm telling you now." He read her the relevant sections of the insurance document. Policy date, beneficiary, face value, current active status. He read them plainly without editorial, just the facts in the order they appeared on the page. The room was very quiet. Lena sat with her hands open on her knees, palms up as if she'd been about to catch something and it had passed through her hands instead. The color in her face didn't drain. It simply became very still, the way water became still when the thing that had disturbed it finally sank. "He put it in the suitcase." Her voice was almost inaudible. "He packed it the night before, told me it was a bag for the specialist visit. He put the document in the bag he packed for me and left the bag at the stop with me." Her hands closed slowly. "He wanted it found. He needed the policy discovered so the claim could be processed. He left it with me because he couldn't file it himself without someone finding the body first." She exhaled once controlled. "He thought it through and he still made a mistake." Sawyer leaned forward. "That mistake is going to cost him significantly." He paused. "I need your permission to access your financial records. We already have probable cause, but your cooperation allows us to move faster." Lena gave her permission clearly and without hesitation. And there was something almost physical in the decision, the way her chin came up a degree, the way her whole frame oriented toward it like something turning to face the thing it had been avoiding and finding it smaller than expected. Sawyer left an hour later with the document, 3 pages of notes and account credentials Lena pulled from memory with the precision of someone whose mind had spent 9 months compensating for what her eyes could no longer do. Wren walked him to the car. "She's solid," Sawyer said at the driver's door. "A lot of people in her situation would be too destabilized to function this clearly. She's going to be a good witness." He paused. "Keep her away from anything Gideon Voss might use to reach her. I'll call when I have something." Wren stood in the damp morning air after the car left and thought about all the ways a plan as deliberate as Gideon Voss's plan required not one single person to pull over on a rainy road. Della Marsh arrived on the 3rd day. She was 53, had been blind since she was 30, and moved through the world with a confidence so complete it registered as mild arrogance, until you understood it was simply 23 years of mastery made physical. She'd worked with the county rehabilitation program for a decade and delivered hard truths in a tone so matter-of-fact they bypassed the usual defenses. Wren had called her the morning after Sawyer's visit because whatever else happened, Lena needed tools that Wren didn't have and couldn't build for her. The first session lasted 2 hours. Wren was at work. Rhett took Piper to the park. He came home that evening to find Lena standing at the kitchen counter making coffee by herself, hands moving through the process with the concentrated precision of someone learning to trust their own competence again. "Della is not gentle," Lena said without turning from the counter. "I was warned about that." Wren set his work bag down. "Is that a problem?" Lena was quiet for a moment. "No. Gentle would have let me keep feeling sorry for myself." She poured the coffee, turned with the mug extended in the direction his voice had come from, and found his hand on the second try. "She told me my independence isn't gone. She said it's just different now. She said different doesn't mean less." The words settled into the kitchen air like something that had been waiting to be said aloud. "I think I needed someone who already knew that to be true before they told me." Wren took the coffee and said nothing because silence after the right sentence was worth more than anything he could add. The second session 3 days later did not go as cleanly. Wren came home at 5:30 to find Rhett on the porch steps with his arms on his knees and a specific expression that meant something had happened inside, and he was deciding how much to say about it. Through the front window, Wren could see Lena on the couch, still hands folded, the posture of someone who had hit a wall and was sitting with the fact of it. He went inside and sat in the chair across from her. He didn't ask immediately. He waited. After a long moment, she said, "Della had me try to navigate to the end of the block and back. Alone." A pause. "I made it to the Hendersons' driveway before I stopped. I just stopped. I couldn't make myself take another step. Her jaw tightened. "I stood on a stranger's sidewalk for 10 minutes before I turned around. That's not progress. That's just evidence of how much he took." Wren leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked at her face, at the particular set of it that he'd learned over the past 2 weeks meant she was building an argument against herself and winning it. "You turned around," he said. "You didn't stay." She was quiet for a moment, processing the reframe. "That's a very small thing to be proud of. It's the right size thing for day 11. He said it plainly, without encouragement wrapped around it, because she'd told him early on that encouragement felt like being handled. "Tomorrow it'll be the Hendersons' driveway plus 2 steps. That's how it works." She didn't respond immediately. Then slowly, some of the argument she'd been constructing against herself lost its footing. She uncrossed her arms and set her hands in her lap and exhaled through her nose in the way that meant something had shifted. "Della said the same thing," she admitted. "Della's been right about everything so far." Something close to a reluctant smile moved across her face and didn't quite arrive. "Don't tell her that. She'll become insufferable." The days that followed found their rhythm. Della came every other morning. Lena walked further each session, learning the block and segments the way you learned any new language, one phrase at a time, until the phrases connected and the sentences made sense. By the end of the second week, she could walk to the corner store on Aldine Street and back without guidance. Her cane finding the information, her eyes no longer supplied her pace, gaining a quality that was less careful and more deliberate, which were different things. Piper, entirely self-appointed, ran a parallel operation. Every evening after school, she sat beside Lena and described things, not just shape or color, but personality, the specific way a thing was itself. The oak tree in the backyard had arms instead of branches. The kitchen was the color of early morning. The truck sounded like it was always thinking about something important. Lena received each description with the attention of someone building an interior map that would have to serve where photographs could not. One evening, Wren came in from the garage to find the two of them in the living room. Piper cross-legged on the cushion beside Lena, both very still, and Piper saying in her careful voice, "Daddy's hands look like they've been through things, but in a good way, like they chose the work they did." Wren stood in the doorway without announcing himself, which was something he would not have admitted to anyone. Sawyer called on the 8th day. Wren took it in the backyard, standing near the fence with the late October afternoon going gray around him. He listened without interrupting. When Sawyer finished, Wren stood with the phone at his side for a moment before going inside. He found Lena in the garage at the corner of his workbench he'd cleared for her use, hands moving over a piece of silver wire with the particular concentration of someone listening with their fingertips. She'd started that morning with the tools Della had helped her order, beginning with simple forms, relearning the weight and temperature of metal. She didn't stop when he came in, but turned her head slightly in his direction. He sat on the stool across the bench and told her what Sawyer had told him. Gideon had not simply drained their joint accounts. Using her forged signature, he had sold the entirety of Lena Voss Designs, the brand, the client database, the intellectual property, the business accounts to a shell company registered in Brentwood, Tennessee, 4 months before the night at the bus stop. The sale price was well below market value, consistent with a transaction designed for speed rather than return. Total assets transferred or stolen exceeded $310,000. The business she had spent a decade building was on paper no longer hers. Lena's hands stopped. She set down the wire and placed both palms flat on the workbench, fingers spread, and sat very still. The garage held its quiet except for the distant sound of a neighbor's leaf blower and the refrigerator in the corner clicking on. "He didn't leave me." The words came out quiet and level without inflection, which was somehow the most devastating possible delivery. "He erased me. He spent a year turning me into someone who didn't exist. No money, no business, no identity, no sight. He was going to file the insurance claim, and I was going to be a missing person with no assets and no one who knew where to look." A pause that had real weight in it. "He almost did it." Wren didn't speak. He'd learned in the past 8 days that Lena's silences were not gaps waiting to be filled. They were part of how she processed, necessary and structural. "I want to rebuild it," she said eventually. Her hands came off the bench and found the wire again. "The business, not for him. I don't want anything I do to be because of him. I want it because those 10 years were mine, and what I made with them was real, and I'm not going to let the last chapter of that story be him." Wren looked at her hands moving over the metal. The way they found their information through contact, through pressure and texture and heat, the way they seemed to know things. "Then we take it back," he said. She worked for another hour after that, longer than she'd worked any single session since arriving. When she finally set the wire down and stretched her hands open on the bench, there was something in her posture that hadn't been there before, a quality of resolution that sat differently than composure, less defended and more forward-facing. Wren went inside to start dinner and did not say anything about what he'd observed because some things collapsed when you named them too soon. On the 11th day, a man in a gray suit came to the front door. Wren was in the backyard replacing a fence board when Rhett appeared at the back door with his phone in his hand and an expression that communicated something had happened inside, requiring Wren's specific authority to address. The man had a leather portfolio and the posture of someone paid well enough to remain pleasant during unpleasant errands. He presented a sealed envelope addressed to Lena Voss. Inside, as Wren discovered when he opened it without apology in the man's presence, was a 2-page document offering Lena $15,000 in exchange for her signed agreement to waive all present and future legal claims against an unnamed client, including any criminal referrals. Wren read it twice. He handed it back. "Tell whoever sent you that the next time someone comes to this address on his behalf, I'm calling Detective Sawyer before I open the door. And tell him the document is going to Sawyer's office by end of day." The man left without another word. Wren stood on the porch after the car pulled away and understood two things simultaneously. Gideon knew exactly where Lena was, and he was frightened enough of what she could do to spend money trying to prevent it. Those were not the actions of someone who believed he was winning. He called Sawyer, photographed both pages, and moved Piper to Rhett's apartment that afternoon, framed as a sleepover with her favorite book and the specific blanket she needed. He kissed her goodnight while Rhett pretended not to notice that Wren checked the lock on the front door twice on the way out. Back at the house on Clover Street, he added deadbolts front and back, checked every ground floor window, and left the porch light burning. Lena knew something had shifted from the changed quality of the house when he returned the new sounds of hardware, the particular silence of someone moving through rooms with purpose. She didn't ask for details he wasn't offering, and he gave her the ones she needed. Gideon knew her location. Sawyer had been informed the situation was being handled. She received this with the composure of someone who had already survived the worst version of this fear and was now simply managing its residue. That night he sat at the kitchen table after she'd gone to bed and thought about what Rhett had said 3 days earlier. They'd been in the driveway after Della's second visit. Rhett leaning against the truck watching Wren unload lumber, and Rhett had said it in the flat tone he used when he intended to say something exactly once. "You're falling for her, Wren." Wren hadn't answered. He'd lifted another board and carried it to the garage, and when he came back, Rhett was still there, still waiting, which was the Rhett version of insistence. "She's been here less than 2 weeks, Wren said. "That's not a denial." Rhett uncrossed his arms. "I'm not telling you it's wrong. I'm telling you I can see it, which means she probably can too, which means you should figure out what you're doing before it figures itself out without you." Wren had gone back to the lumber without answering, and he sat now at the table in the quiet house and understood that the question wasn't going away. He thought about Claire, about the way grief worked on a person over 5 years, slowly becoming less a wound and more a room you carried inside, you always present, not always painful, but never fully unoccupied. He thought about whether you could love someone while still living in that room, whether the room could have a window without betraying the person who used to live there with you. He didn't resolve it. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed and lay awake listening to the house around him, to the particular silence of a structure that was holding more than it had been built to hold and doing it anyway. On the 16th day, Piper came home from Rhett's, and an hour later knocked on the guest room door and asked if she could use the phone on the nightstand to call her friend Joss about a homework question. Lena said, "Of course, it's right on the stand." Piper took it and went down the hall to her own room. On the 17th day late afternoon, Lena came to the kitchen doorway while Wren was making dinner. Her arms were crossed low against her ribs, and her face held the absence of expression that he'd come to recognize as the specific look of someone who had decided to say something and was already past the point of deciding not to. "I need to tell you something I did." He turned from the stove. 3 days ago I borrowed Piper's phone. I called my old number, the one Gideon has now. She paused. "I know how that sounds. I wasn't trying to talk to him. I wanted to hear his voice so I could remember that what I was afraid of was a real thing and not something I'd manufactured out of trauma." Her jaw tightened. He answered. He didn't recognize the number. He thought it was a missed dial and kept talking to whoever he was already with. She stopped. Wren set down the spatula. He said the words, "She won't be a problem much longer." Each word arrived separately with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the delivery because the content needed to land exactly right. "He was talking to someone else about me. I was on the line listening and I had the presence of mind to record it, the entire call, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I still have it on Piper's phone." The kitchen held its quiet for a long moment. Wren crossed to the table and sat down, not from weakness, but from the need to be lower to the ground while he absorbed this. He looked at the woman in the doorway of his kitchen in the fading afternoon light, her hair dry and her hands steady and her face composed, and he understood something that had been taking shape at the edges of his awareness for days. She had not spent 17 days being rescued. She had spent 17 days rebuilding herself from the inside out quietly and without announcement, and she had done it while simultaneously constructing the single most important piece of evidence in the case against her husband. And she had done it alone because she hadn't yet decided whether the structure around her was solid enough to share the weight. She was telling him now because she had decided it was. "Piper's phone is in her room," Lena said. Wren called Sawyer at 6:17. Sawyer was at the house by 7. He listened to the recording on speaker at the kitchen table, 4 minutes and 17 seconds of Gideon Voss's voice moving through an unguarded conversation in which he used the specific phrase twice and referenced in terms that were not explicit but were more than sufficient, the expectation of a financial outcome contingent on a particular resolution. Sawyer played it twice and saved it 3 ways. This changes the charge architecture significantly. For the first time since Wren had known him, Sawyer's voice carried something close to satisfaction. Strong circumstantial on the fraud. This gives us something much closer to direct on the endangerment. He stopped and looked at Lena across the table. "You did this in the middle of everything else you were carrying." Lena had both hands around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "He tried to erase me," she said. "He forgot I learned how to listen." Sawyer left at 9. Rhett, who had come for dinner and stayed through the call, washed the dishes in the kitchen with the specific quiet of a person who understood the room needed to decompress and that dishes were a useful reason to remain in it. Wren went to the front porch. After a few minutes, the door opened and Lena came out, one hand on the door frame, and then she found the porch railing with her palm and came to stand beside him. The night was cold and clear, the first clear night after weeks of rain, and the sky above Clover Street had the depth it got in late October when the air was dry and the stars had nothing to diffuse through. "Are you scared?" Her voice was quiet. She was facing forward into the dark that was always dark for her. He thought about the answer that was technically true but didn't cost anything. He thought about what she'd just done with a borrowed phone in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He decided she had earned the real version. Terrified. He looked out at the street. "But I'm more scared of doing nothing than I am of doing something that doesn't work out." She turned her head slightly in his direction. The silence that followed was not the silence of absence, but of two people present in the same moment who didn't need to reduce it. Gideon Voss was arrested in Reno, Nevada, 19 days after he left his wife at a bus stop on Route 9. He was living in a furnished apartment paid for with the proceeds of the Lena Voss design sale, and when officers executed the warrant, they found on his laptop a partially completed missing persons report template that had never been filed, which told its own story about what he had been waiting for. Sawyer called Wren at 6 in the morning. Wren sat with the information for a moment. Then he got up, made coffee, and knocked on the guest room door. He told Lena simply and directly the way he'd learned she preferred. She sat on the edge of the bed and nodded once, and her shoulders dropped a degree, the invisible weight of 19 days of sustained vigilance releasing by the smallest measurable fraction. The trial was set for 6 weeks out. That evening, Piper sat beside Lena at the kitchen table and drew pictures of the backyard squirrel, while Lena worked a piece of copper beside her, both of them quiet and industrious in the easy parallel of people who had stopped needing a reason to occupy the same space. Wren moved between the kitchen and the hallway, finishing things, listening to the particular silence of the table, and understood that what he was witnessing was not a guest and a child sitting together, but something that had become, without anyone announcing it, a household finding its shape. He finished the dishes and left them to it, and did not say anything about what the table looked like with both of them at it, because some things were better held than named, at least for now. At least until he knew what he intended to do about the room inside him, that had lately begun to feel less like a memorial and more like a place with a view. The Millhaven County Courthouse was a 3-story limestone building on the corner of 4th and Broad that had absorbed a century of consequential moments into its walls, the way old buildings absorbed weather quietly and permanently. Wren had parked on Broad Street at 8:15 and come around to help Lena down from the passenger seat, and she took his arm the way she always did now, without ceremony, the gesture having long since crossed the boundary between practical and simply true. The December morning was sharp and clear. Lena wore a dark green dress and her hair down, and she moved up the courthouse steps with her hand on Wren's arm and her chin at a level that communicated something to everyone who saw her. What it communicated was that she had already decided how this day would go, and the proceedings inside were largely a formality, confirming a conclusion she had reached on her own terms weeks ago. The gallery filled faster than Sawyer had predicted. People from Millhaven, and some from farther out, a few journalists, and near the back a row that included Della Marsh in a burgundy coat sitting straight-backed with the composure of someone who had been through harder things than a courtroom and emerged with their posture intact. Rhett sat beside Wren in the second row. Piper was at school, where she would remain until 3 o'clock, a condition she had accepted after extracting a promise of complete documentation. She had also sent Lena to the courthouse with a folded note in her coat pocket, which contained, as Lena had reported in the car, a drawing of a small figure with a cape and the words, "You already won," in Piper's deliberate second-grade handwriting. Gideon Voss sat at the defense table in a suit that fit too well for a man who had spent 5 weeks in county custody, which meant he'd had it sent in, which meant he still believed presentation could shift something. His attorney Cutler sat beside him with the controlled economy of movement of a man who had reviewed the discovery materials and understood the arithmetic was not favorable. Gideon did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Lena. Lena sat at the prosecution table beside A.D.A. Hess, with her hands flat on the surface. Her posture the same composure Wren had watched her build from scratch over 2 months, the kind that was not performed but constructed load-bearing. The charges were read: fraudulent misrepresentation, forgery, financial exploitation, and the count that landed on the gallery with a specific silence criminal attempt person. The formal language for what Gideon Voss had tried to accomplish on a rainy October night on Route 9. Cutler entered not guilty on all counts in the voice of a professional who was paid not to editorialize. Hess's first 2 hours were methodical. The forensic accountant walked the jury through 14 months of financial architecture, the systematic transfers, the forged signatures on the business sale, the insurance policy purchased 2 months into Lena's blindness, the domestic account movements that had reduced Lena's individual holdings to functionally zero. The jury watched with the focused attention of people doing math and not liking where it landed. On the second day, Lena took the stand. She moved to the witness box with Hess guiding her elbow once and releasing, and she found the railing with her fingertips and sat. Then she reached up and removed the blindfold. The courtroom went quiet in the way large rooms went quiet when something unrehearsed and irrevocable occurred inside them. Her eyes were pale green, and they didn't fix on any point, but they were open and present, and Gideon Voss was the first person in the room to look away from them. He turned his face down toward the defense table and found something to study in the wood. Wren noticed this and felt something cold settle in him with the particular satisfaction of a thing confirmed. Hess walked Lena through her testimony with precision. Lena described her marriage, her business, her vision loss, the dependency that followed the slow withdrawal of information, the phone calls she wasn't supposed to hear, the questions returned to her as symptoms of instability. Her voice was even throughout, not cold, but calibrated the voice of someone who had decided that accuracy was the most powerful thing she could bring into this room. Cutler's cross-examination began after the lunch recess. He worked the perimeter of her testimony for 20 minutes, probing the voluntariness of the financial arrangements, the absence of any formal complaint prior to October. He was building toward something, and the room felt it the way you felt pressure before specific weather. Then he played the recording. It was from 11 months ago, a home recording from a shared cloud backup. In it, Lena's voice said clearly that she wanted Gideon to handle the financials going forward, that she trusted him completely with everything they'd built. The recording was unambiguous, and when it ended, Cutler let the silence extend for the exact number of seconds required before delivering his question with the measured confidence of a man placing a card he'd been holding all game. "Ms. Voss, does that sound like someone being exploited? Or does it sound like someone who made a free and informed choice?" Lena was quiet. Not the silence of someone caught, but the silence of someone selecting where to begin from an abundance of options. "That recording was made 14 months ago," she said. "At that time I had full vision, full access to my accounts, and had verified our financial statements myself the week prior." She turned her face toward the jury with the accuracy of someone who had learned to orient by the quality of a room's attention, finding its center without sight. "What happened after that recording is that I lost my sight. My world contracted to what I could hear and touch and remember, and the person whose voice I trusted most used that contraction to take everything I could no longer monitor myself." She paused for one beat. "Playing a recording of my trust doesn't demonstrate the trust was honored. It demonstrates how long the preparation for betraying it took." Cutler adjusted. He challenged the business sale timeline, suggested mutual decision-making during marital stress. Lena answered each question with the same calibrated accuracy, and Wren understood something that had been assembling itself in him for weeks. She had not come into this room to survive the cross-examination. She had come to dismantle it from the inside. Cutler paused, consulted with Gideon in a murmur, and stood again. "Ms. Voss, you've testified that you have no recording of the alleged statements made by Mr. Voss regarding your endangerment. Is that correct?" Hess objected. Sustained. But Cutler had planted what he intended, and the jury had heard the question, and questions had weight regardless of rulings. Hess stood for redirect. She looked at Lena. "Ms. Voss, do you in fact have a recording of statements made by Gideon Voss regarding your situation?" Lena's hands were still on the railing. "Yes." The recording played through the courtroom speakers. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of Gideon Voss's voice in an unguarded phone conversation using the specific phrase "she won't be a problem much longer," and then later a reference to a financial outcome contingent on a resolution that no longer required her participation in any form. The recording was clear. The voice was identifiable. The jury listened to all of it without moving. When it ended, the courtroom had the quality of a room in which something irrevocable had just occurred, and everyone present understood they had witnessed it. Gideon Voss was looking at the defense table. Cutler was writing on his legal pad with the focused performance of a man composing himself for the benefit of the client beside him. Hess let the silence hold for 5 full seconds. Then, nothing further. Lena sat in the witness chair with her eyes open and did not put the blindfold back on. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Wren sat in the courthouse hallway with Rhett on a wooden bench installed sometime in the 1950s and not improved upon since. Lena was with Hess in a conference room down the hall. Della had brought sandwiches from the deli 2 blocks over, and none of them made significant progress on them. Sawyer leaned against the wall across the corridor with his arms folded, and twice he checked his phone and twice put it away, and the corridor had the specific quality of a space where people were waiting for a weight to be lifted or confirmed. When the jury filed back in, Wren found Lena's hand under the gallery railing and held it. She held back. Guilty on all counts, Gideon Voss received 12 years consecutive on the 2 principal charges with a mandatory restitution order requiring the return of all transferred assets plus assessed damages, a total financial judgment of $378,000. He signed the divorce papers at a small table in a side room before transfer to state custody in the handwriting of a man who had finally understood the full dimensions of what he had miscalculated. Lena stood on the courthouse steps in the December sun and said nothing for a long time. The sun was low and direct, and it fell across her face, and she stood in it with her eyes open and her hands at her sides, and let it. Sawyer came out last. He shook Wren's hand, looked at Lena and said the thing in the voice he reserved for things that mattered. "You built that case, we carried it, you built it." Then he went down the steps to his car, without waiting for a response, which was the Sawyer version of a complete sentence. Piper was on the front porch of the house on Clover Street when they pulled into the driveway in her school clothes, with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She came down the steps at a run and went directly to Lena and put both arms around her waist without preamble, and Lena held her with both arms and pressed her face into the top of Piper's head and was still. Rhett, coming up behind Wren from the second car, said quietly, "Yeah, kid, she won." Piper pulled back far enough to look up at Lena's face. "I told everybody at school I already knew how it ended." The satisfaction in her voice was complete and unhurried. "Was I right?" Lena laughed, and it was the fullest version of that sound Wren had heard, unguarded and warm, and taking up its full space in the cold December air. "You were completely right." The weeks that followed had a quality Wren hadn't experienced in a long time. The restitution order moved through the courts, and Lena's accounts began their slow restoration. Hess's office challenged the fraudulent business transfer, and the shell company's assets were frozen pending adjudication. Lena signed a lease on a studio 2 blocks from the house, a second-floor room above a frame shop with a workbench she could configure to her own system, and she moved her workspace out of his garage on a Tuesday in January with the deliberateness of someone who was building the next chapter by hand rather than drifting into it. She still came for dinner most evenings. She still sat on the porch with Wren after Piper went to bed, talking in the way that had developed its own grammar, following its own logic, neither of them naming what it was, because naming it felt like it would reduce something that was larger than its name. Rhett said nothing more. He had made his observation once in October, and he was not the type to repeat himself when a situation was clearly moving on its own terms. Lena's first completed new piece from the studio was a pendant silver with a form that suggested a tree from above the root structure and the branch structure mirroring each other, so that from certain angles you couldn't tell which was which growth or foundation, what held and what reached. She worked on it over 3 evenings, and when it was finished, she held it for a long time between her fingers, reading it through her palms. Then she brought it to the house on Clover Street on a Wednesday after dinner and set a small box on the kitchen table in front of Piper. Piper opened it with the care of someone who understood the weight of the gesture. She lifted the pendant and ran her thumb across the surface the way she'd watched Lena work for months tracing the form. "It feels like something real," she said, "like something that actually grew." Lena's hand found Piper's across the table. "It's for you, for being brave enough to let a stranger sit next to you the first night." Piper worked the clasp around her own neck with the focused effort of a child managing something small and important, and looked down at where the pendant settled and then up at Lena, and her face carried the particular quality of understanding something for the first time that she would spend years understanding better. She didn't say anything else. She just kept her hand over the pendant for a moment, and that was enough. The client list rebuilt itself faster than Lena had projected. Word moved through the channels. It moved through, and by February she had more commissions than she could manage alone. She hired Maya, a recent art school graduate who handled the visual and digital work, the photographs and the website consultations, while the design and fabrication remained entirely Lena's. Each piece left the studio with a small card, designed by touch, built with love. This was not a marketing decision. It was a fact, and it was also a statement about what hands knew that eyes sometimes couldn't reach. The collaboration with Wren began the way the best things began, without anyone deciding to start. She came to his garage one Saturday to see a jewelry box commission he was working through, ran her hands over the dovetail joints and the lid surface, and said she could do something with the inlay, a detail in metal that would change the piece entirely. He said, "Let's try it." The first piece took 2 weekends, and when they delivered it, the client held it with both hands and her eyes filled, which was not something Wren had previously induced in a client, and which moved him in a way he hadn't anticipated. They made 4 more in the following weeks, and the pieces began to carry both their names. Piper wrote the first 3 chapters of a book in March about a girl who couldn't see but could read people's intentions through the quality of their voice. She read them aloud at dinner one evening with the performer's instinct she had been born with, and Wren and Lena listened from opposite ends of the table, and Rhett, who had arrived for dinner as he often did, put his fork down twice. When Piper finished, the table was quiet. "You should keep going," Lena said. Piper looked at her with the directness that had never changed from the first night on the couch. "The main character is based on you. I changed her name, though. I hope that's okay." "What did you name her?" "Iris," Piper said, with the certainty of someone who had already decided and was simply reporting. "Because she sees things other people miss." On a Thursday evening in late March, Rhett was in the kitchen with the radio on low, and Piper was upstairs with her manuscript, and Wren and Lena were in the garage, which had become their shared space in the evenings when the day's work was done, and neither of them was ready for the night to end. Lena was at her corner of the workbench with a piece of copper, and Wren was sanding a cabinet door at the main bench, and the garage had the specific warmth of a room where 2 people were working in comfortable parallel, each absorbed in their own thing, while aware of the other. Lena set down her tools. She turned toward him with the accuracy she always had, finding him by the sound of the sandpaper against the wood, and she said his name the way she said it when she had assembled something she'd been working on longer than the current conversation. He set down the sandpaper. "I've been in love with you since November." She said it without preamble, without the runway of smaller statements that people sometimes use to prepare the landing. "I didn't say it because the trial was happening, and I needed to know that what I was feeling was real and not just proximity to the only steady thing in a very unsteady time." Her hands rested on the edge of the workbench. "It's March now. I've had 3 months of a stable life to test the feeling against, and it hasn't changed. It's gotten more specific. I know it the way I know a piece is right when I hold it, not because I can see it, but because everything about the weight and the balance tells me so." A pause. "I love you, Wren." I wanted to say it somewhere it wasn't complicated by anything outside this room. The garage was quiet except for the refrigerator in the corner, and somewhere outside the first crickets of the season attempting their season's first notes. Wren came around the main bench. He moved to her end of the workbench and leaned against it beside her close enough that she knew exactly where he was, and he looked at the side of her face, at the profile he had been looking at in different lights for 5 months, and he thought about the 40 yards of road he'd almost kept driving, and felt something close to vertigo at the proximity of what might not have happened. "I've been in love with you since I watched Piper describe the backyard to you in October," he said. "The second week when she told you the oak tree had arms instead of branches, and you laughed and said that was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about a tree." He paused. "I've been carrying Claire for 5 years. I'll carry some part of her always, and I needed to know whether that was a wall or just a room I lived in. It's a room. It doesn't close off what I feel for you. It exists alongside it." He reached for her hand where it rested on the bench and held it. "I'm not scared of loving you. I'm only scared I let the obvious thing take longer than it needed to." She turned her face toward him, and he leaned in, and she met him halfway, and the garage held them in its particular warmth with the tools and the workbenches and the smell of sawdust and metal, and outside the March night was cold and clear, and the crickets made their tentative first argument for spring. The door from the house opened. Piper stood in the doorway in her pajamas with her manuscript pages in one hand and the expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion rather than a surprise. She stood still for approximately 4 seconds, taking in the scene with the unhurried assessment of a child who had been expecting this for some time and was now simply confirming the date. Then she turned very deliberately toward the house, toward the kitchen where Rhett was visible through the window at the sink, and raised her voice to a carrying register. "Uncle Rhett, you owe me $10. A pause from the kitchen. Then Rhett's voice, resigned and complete. "I know I do." Piper turned back to the doorway. She looked at the two of them with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction had resolved on schedule and held up her manuscript pages with the other hand. "I'm going to put this in Chapter 4, she announced. "It's going to be the best chapter." Then she went back inside and the door swung shut. And through the kitchen window they could see Rhett drying his hands on a dish towel and shaking his head with the expression of a man who had been conclusively outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old and was entirely at peace with every aspect of it. Lena laughed against Wren's shoulder and he held her, and the garage was warm around them. 2 years later, Piper was 9 and certain about most things, and writing the second book in her series. The main character, Iris, had acquired a following among the regional publisher's early readers, and 2 schools in the county had requested the first book for their libraries, which Piper received as confirmation of what she had already known. She wore the silver pendant every day, which she had mentioned in the author biography. The publisher asked her to write a detail that had made Lena go very still for a moment when she heard it read aloud. Lena Voss Designs operated across 11 states. The studio above the frame shop had a waiting list, and Maya had become indispensable in ways that went beyond the original job description. The collaborative line with Wren, Calloway, and Voss had been picked up by a gallery in Columbus after a regional design fair, and the pieces moved faster than they made them, which was a problem they addressed by enjoying it. Wren's woodworking studio had a name now, a sign above the garage door that Piper had painted in her best handwriting, and 3 of his pieces were in the Columbus gallery alongside the collaborative work. He had stopped taking renovation contracts in September. The long days of other people's kitchens had given way to the long days of his own design, which was harder in some ways and sustaining in ways the other work had never been. On a Saturday in October, almost exactly 2 years from the night on Route 9, Wren drove back from a materials run in the next county on the old section of the road. The afternoon was clear and cold, the fields on either side amber and rust with the seas in the sky, the particular shade of October blue that had no equivalent in other months. Lena was in the passenger seat with her hand resting on the center console close to his without quite touching. Piper was asleep in the back seat, her second manuscript draft folded in her lap, her head against the window. The old bus stop appeared on the right side of the road. The reflective post and the bench beneath the overhang weathered further than it had been, surrounded now by tall grass that had grown up through the gravel over 2 seasons of disuse. Wren's hand shifted on the wheel. Lena felt the change in the car, the slight deceleration, the quality of his attention moving to the right side of the road. She had ridden this road with him before. She knew what was out there. He didn't say anything. He just drove past it slowly, and the stop receded in the rear view, and the road continued forward in the low October light. After a moment, Lena lifted her hand from the console and placed it over his on the wheel, and he turned his palm up and they held on. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "what that night cost, and what it opened." She was quiet for a beat. "I spent hours there waiting for a life I thought I was owed, a life I thought I was supposed to go back to. And then you stopped, and I understood slowly over months that what I'd been waiting for my whole life wasn't behind me at all." She turned her face toward the windshield, toward the road ahead in the afternoon light. It was in a truck on a rainy road that didn't know it was about to change everything. Wren held her hand and drove. From the back seat came the soft sound of Piper shifting in her sleep, the whisper of manuscript pages rearranging themselves. Then her voice came drowsy and unhesitating from some place between sleep and waking. "The best stories start when someone decides to stop."